I want to welcome everybody. This is our first return seminar at the Cyber Policy Center and at the Program on Democracy and the Internet here at the Stanford Cyber Policy Center in Stanford PAX. And we have the distinct honor to be announcing a new program that's going to be run through the Program on Democracy and the Internet. We're going to talk today about the multi-stakeholder approach to content moderation and what this new content policy and society lab here at Stanford is going to be doing. And I'm honored to introduce the new director and deputy director of the Content Policy and Society Lab, Julie Iwono and Dr. Niyusha Roshani. And Julie Iwono is the executive director of Internet Sans Frontières and inaugural member of the Facebook Oversight Board. And an affiliate of the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard and executive director of this new lab. Julie's work is at the intersection of business and human rights and focuses on creating channels of collaboration between different sets of actors on the internet. She's particularly interested in finding policy and technical solutions for better content moderation on online platforms, which is leading to this new program. Dr. Niyusha Roshani is the deputy director of the new Capsule Lab and the co-founder of Global Black Youth, that connects, amplifies, and invests in the reach and impact of the most cutting-edge technology generated by young Black innovators and entrepreneurs on a global scale. She's expertise in research, policy, and practice, working in more than 25 countries in directing organizations and programs, establishing strategic partnerships, and working with entrepreneurs, CSOs, philanthropy, the private and public sectors. So I'm thrilled that they have both are joining us today and at Stanford generally. And the way we thought we would handle this session today is to have them present a little bit about their vision for the lab and about this topic of content moderation in a kind of global perspective generally. And then I'll ask them some questions both about the topic and their ambitions here, and then we'll open it up for questions that you can put in the Q&A in the form below. So why don't I turn it over to Julie Iwono and we'll go from there.
Thank you very much, Professor Persley or Nate. It's a great honor for us to kick off this fall seminar series at the Cyber Policy Center, and also a great honor to introduce to the Stanford audience, but also beyond, who joined us today. Thank you for your presence. Introduce this new lab that my colleague Niyusha and I will be working on. So before we get too much into the subject, I thought it would be interesting to revisit the news. So you should be able to see right now my screen. And sorry about that. So in the recent weeks, days even, there have been so much news about content. I deliberately chose not to include anything related to the Wall Street Journal, but this is just some examples of all the news that has been shared recently about offline, online, and the relationship with both. One of the greatest discussion at the moment is on the content moderation, is that content moderation is not the only problem when it comes to content, and leave up and take down are not the only solution. So there is a call for more nuanced conversation. I've pasted here an op-ed that was written by Evelyn Douek from the Harvard Law School in the Wired magazine. I really strongly advise you to read it. I've also added a screenshot from an article in the New York Times where the author, the journalist Adam Satchery, speaks to people in Germany who have studied the positive impact, the usefulness basically of the NetzDG regulation. So that law, anti-hate speech and anti-fake news law that was passed in the country 3 years ago now. I've also added news about court orders that Facebook received recently in relation to releasing content that might be helpful to understand the genocide that happened in Myanmar 3 years ago too. I apologize, I'm a bit lost in time frame over there. And I've also thought it would be interesting, since part of our discussion today will focus a lot on, the global implications of content moderation, content policy. We'll get deeper into the subject in a few minutes. But basically, also sharing some information about what's been happening in South Africa, where since the arrest of former President Jacob Zuma, there have been violence and serious violence, especially during the summer in July. And social media were used not only by looters, but also by officials and public forces, particularly to crack down on the protest. And also very recently, there was a news about a COVID misinformation related murder in Germany, where a cashier was killed. A young man was killed by someone who did not want to wear a mask. So all this to launch this discussion and also put forward a survey. I'm going to stop my screen sharing here. We've prepared a survey and hoping that you would help us answer to that question. There is also another very, very provocative thinking right now, which is, and I think it's Shira Ovid, who wrote in the New York Times and an op-ed saying that probably social media, and particularly Facebook, probably social media shouldn't be available everywhere, and probably shouldn't be available where countries do not have institutions that are strong enough to respond to the harms caused by social media. Thinking of countries like Myanmar, generally countries with more fragile institutions. So our question here, quite provocative, and will reveal the answers later on. Our question to you is, should social media companies only operate in countries with strong institutions? Whether or not you agree, please respond. And whether you think it depends, please also don't hesitate to respond. I will continue to share my screen, hoping that it doesn't affect the visibility of the poll, to go on into the presentation. So, sorry about that. Of course, we would have some technical problems. So we are at the law school, and we thought it would be important to set the definitions of what we're talking about. So I'll hand it over to my colleague, Nusha, to walk you through that.
Thank you very much, Julie. It's great to be part of this conversation. Thank you very much to everyone. As we're thinking about the definition and really thinking about how we're going to call this, really going beyond content moderation, we chose content policy, and we also acknowledge that there's no real definition of content policy, but we wanted to, the way that we understand it is that it's the entire realm of content going beyond content moderation, of leaving up or taking down, to look at all the different components of content, from what and whom determines and creates rules, whom does it involve, looking at, for example, different stakeholders and standpoints of human rights, who controls it, political censorship, legal frameworks. And because there's no real definition of it, we want to be able to really craft together with the different stakeholders this new definition. We chose the terminology and the approach of multi-stakeholderism. We understand that to governance as a way to employ and bring multiple stakeholders together to participate in dialogue, in design and decision-making, and the implementation of responses to challenges of online content. And we chose the words society and lab because we chose the words because we acknowledge that content policy at scale will never be perfect and needs constant updating and contributions by different stakeholders globally. So this is a safe space to experiment, harness global knowledge and lessons learned, and craft innovative pathways to addressing online content challenges.
Oops, sorry about that. Okay, great. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, onto my
sorry, that's my, I apologize. I was responding to the chat at the same time. I really apologize. So here are some of the definitions that have driven the thinking around the Content Policy and Society Lab. In addition to these reflections that we've had, they're actually a result of several problems that we identify. So first of all, of course, when we talk about harmful content online, we have to think about the global nature of the platforms. The fact that Facebook, for instance, is accessible here in the US, but also in Papua New Guinea when it's not shut down by the government. And so do harmful content. The same way normal content transit through these platforms, it's the same way that harmful content will do. And particularly through exploiting the policy and technical vulnerabilities that might be observed on every platform. The second problem that we identified is that there is a limited existing research on taking the multi-stakeholder approach that's being used in internet governance realms as of now mainly, but adding it to the content policy space is not something that's being dealt with frequently in the academic space. There are some research papers, but not that much. And what we've also observed is that the global approach might be limited sometimes. The other aspect is that it might be, we've come across studies of specific platforms and how they apply multi-stakeholderism within the platform. But yes, we always want to keep in mind the global nature, which I mentioned initially, and the borderlessness between the platforms themselves. And also the issue of lack of context, which is another very important discussion to have in the content moderation and content policy space in general. What is the context? Context is, of course, a country, a culture, but also individual context. You are not, as a woman, you will not experience social media the same way as you would if you were a man. It's been documented that females are more susceptible to be targeted by harassment and so many other gender-based violence online. And also the multi-sectoral perspective was, we think, important to highlight as well, because, well, linked to the context issue, it's important to have different perspective, either legal, also anthropologic, and so many others. And last but not least, of the problems that we identified that had us busy the past few months with Nusha discussing this project, automated content moderation systems, which are increasingly used by companies, not only social media, but many others, and blind content takedown government orders are posing serious threats to human rights and particularly to freedom of expression. And so, faced with these problems, we thought about this solution that we will now present more into detail, which is the Content Policy and Society Lab, which will create a safe space for companies, organizations from civil society, content moderators who are not often in this conversation, as well as government representatives to exchange, to research and collaborate together based on shared knowledge and shared challenges that each of these public and stakeholders are facing. The other aspect of this Content Policy and Society Lab, which my colleague would go deeper into, is the international network and decentralized mini hubs initiatives that we would like to foster. And last but not least, still with this idea that knowledge should be accessible, to organizations as well, which are not located in the US or at Stanford, particularly where we are right now. Well, we aim to publish also data-powered findings and learnings from some of the activities that we will put out through this project. And I'll hand it over again to Nusha.
Thank you, Julie. So the first thing we want to do is really creating a safe space where everybody not only has a seat at the table, but has a say in the design and the decision-making, the implementation of, and crafting of solutions moving forward. We want to create a collaborative environment. We do realize that it's not that simple. We also realize that we will have to not romanticize the multi-stakeholder model, but we think that this is the only way to move forward. We also have a governance structure that reflects the multi-stakeholder approach of the lab, with an advisory board that boasts of representatives from the private sector, government, civil society, academia, but also including content moderators who are never really consulted in this process and who are at the forefront of content moderation. And we'll also like to announce that on October 14, we'll have our inaugural workshop looking at moderating dangerous organizations, really reflecting again the multi-stakeholder model of the lab. And we'll have somebody from civil society, government, from the private sector, and a content moderator who will come together and discuss these very difficult and topics and challenges. And but we also want to make sure that we're not just looking at social media companies, but platforms dealing with content in general. And so on our second workshop in November, which we invite you to be part of, is we'll look at how is it that the private sector, moving beyond the usual suspects of Facebook, Twitter, and the likes, are really looking and dealing with content in general. So we also, in this process, we believe that in this collaborative process, we wanted there to be mutual learning, because it's the only way that we'll avoid providing simple solutions to complex problems. So just over 40 new social media laws and numerous policies by industries have been adopted in the last years. Many others are under consideration, but without including all stakeholders and decision-making that affecting most, and particularly the most vulnerable population. So it's extremely important that we propose a mutual learning process through a content policy library that is constantly updated, policy briefs, reports, academic research, and industry principles that will also affect policies, of course. Why is it that we look at an international network? It's really important to think about decentralizing and creating regional hubs globally, right? So it's a path towards democratizing knowledge, innovation, by harnessing knowledge innovation from different sectors and different regions around the world can only enhance our current understandings of the challenges, diversify our approach to addressing the problems, increase mutual understanding of online content issues beyond the current knowledge, offers a significant benefit. Countries, but also looking at countries that are not on the priority list, right? They're not the usual suspect, are often left to their own accounts. So how is it that we make sure that we involved the key actors who are at the forefront of content policy, dealing with it, but also coming up with very important solutions and lessons that could be very useful to different contexts around the world, and then informing platforms that often lack the knowledge about the different contexts globally. Julie, back to you.
About that. Yes. Yes. Before we transition to the Q&A, and before I let you note down the address to get in touch with us if you're interested, I would like to ask if we could screen the results from the survey, the poll that we shared earlier today. It's interesting for us to have, okay, well, great. So 50% are, wow, it's a tie. 50% not in favor of only having social media in countries with strong institutions, and other who think 50% who think it depends. Honestly, the depends part is very interesting, and it probably shows how important it is to have nuanced conversation about these problems. What might appear as an easy solution, for us, for me, sitting here in the US at the moment, might not be that simple for people around the world who rely on social media to be able to speak to their powers. And it's within that it's within those complexities that we think those nuances are important. And to have those nuances, to make sure we have those nuances, having the voices that can, help us think through the nuances is important. And so, yes, we hope this is in general the big picture of what we hope to be able to do with the lab. But we would really much like to stay in touch. So please don't hesitate to ask more questions, or, if you want to get an invitation as well for the workshop, because it's a safe space and most of the conversation, unfortunately, will not be public. But the idea is really to foster, to have everyone feel comfortable enough to share things and information that probably are not usually shared in the public space. So yes, this is basically it. And look forward to the discussion.
Well, thanks so much. And I have some sort of conceptual questions and then more I guess, normative ones. And so the first is, let's discuss what problem you're trying to solve a little bit here, and what is lacking in the current architecture of input to the platforms and to governments. And so, tell me if you agree with this as one sort of characterization of where we are. So much of the discussion of content policy and internet regulation over the last 5 years was really determined or sculpted by the 2016 election in the United States and maybe the Brexit referendum. Like that seems to have been a bit of a turning point in the way people think about social media. Of course, there's been a spiraling downward, almost bracketing from, say, the 2016 election in Cambridge Analytica to the Wall Street Journal stories in the last month, right? With peaks of scandal here and there. I know that when I sort of traveled around the world talking to folks, that there is this sense that those particular events have completely warped the way we think about internet regulation, and that it has obscured some of the real the unique concerns that exist in the global South, both with respect to platform behavior and government behavior with respect to the platforms. Mm-hmm. Can you add a little kind of flesh to that? Like, what is it that you think we're missing under the current non-multi-stakeholder regime? Like, but really specifically, not like, of course, we will always want more voices at the table. We want more people. No one's going to oppose that. But what is really the harm right now, do you think, in the way that people are talking about and considering proposals because of the bias, I think, toward what you accurately describe, I think, is the bias toward a European and, say, American approach to thinking about these issues?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nate. I'll go ahead and give actual flesh to your question with an experience that I've had. When I first came to Stanford through the Digital Civil Society Lab, which is at the Philanthropy and Civil Society Center, PACS, at Stanford. And when I came to that lab, I said, I have a lot of frustration with social media companies because we have been engaging, but there's very little change. I expressed that frustration, and immediately the teams at the lab suggested that I reach out to product teams. And I'm not ashamed today to admit that as a civil society organization who was living, at the time wasn't already in the US, but I was living in Paris, and I really did not have a good knowledge of how a tech company is organized, and even what a product team was. So it took me to come to the Valley to understand that. And once I understood that there were different teams with different responsibilities, and so you probably need to talk differently, or there are different ways to present your frustrations and issues to those different teams. Once we understood that, and that I reported back to my team, it made a lot of things more, I wouldn't say easier, but at least we understood why a lot of things hadn't changed despite the fact that we had been engaging for so many years.
Right.
And so it's that awakening kind of which triggered my question. And I was like, if I in Paris have little knowledge about a product team in a company like Facebook, imagine an organization in Myanmar. Imagine, since we're talking about that country, imagine another one, I don't know, in Brazil probably too. So it's this awakening really that had me question what wasn't working with the status quo. And on the other hand, serving on the Facebook Oversight Board, I also have the opportunity of interacting with different set of teams within the company. And I realized that they do have challenges. So when I as a civil society organization tell them you have to take down content, well, there are lots of things that happen that I wasn't aware of. And it's those conversations. I didn't know about trust and safety professional associations, for instance, which is doing an extremely great job explaining what their job is and explaining how they are structured within different companies. So that knowledge is currently lacking and makes it very difficult to have a constructive dialogue with constructive solutions on these problems that we're facing every day. Honestly, the headlines that we're seeing now are pretty much the same than the ones we saw probably 3, 4, 5 years ago, except that the outcry now is even worse for the public.
You you want to jump in? I have a follow-up. But
thank you. I just want to add to what, echoing what Julie said, a lot of the issues that remains that the solutions are very much worked out in silos, right? In these sectoral silos, you have companies that have these quote unquote secretive operations that are failing to address the problem, right? So there's not really transparency in how they address the problem. And then you have government relying completely on these companies to address the problems. But if we just move even beyond the US context, if we look at, for example, the rest of the world, while we say that we want to embrace inclusion and multi-stakeholderism, in many countries around the world, they use that term, they abuse that term. They would say, like, for example, governments would say, we're using a multi-stakeholder approach, but it's become a buzzword. And we have to also avoid the risk of romanticizing it, to recognize the downfalls if we don't address it well, we don't actually include them. So then a lot of the issues, for example, around civil society is that they're invited to these meetings with government officials, with the private sector, but just the meetings. Their perspectives are not really taken into account. They're not really part of the decision making. This is why, when we say we want to really adopt this process, again, this is very much an experimentary approach, and we don't know if it's going to work. We hope that it's going to work, and this is the only way that we see it forward. But it has to work at all levels, right? From the design to the decision making to the implementation, and not just have them in a meeting, a 2-hour meeting, and come up with a report and say we're global and we're multi-stakeholder. So I think this is something that we should definitely take into account, and that has been key. And as you mentioned, the events in 2016 definitely basically unleash a whole movement globally that brought more light to what's happening in terms of issues of content online.
So, but let's get really concrete here. So Julie mentioned the Myanmar debacle as an example, right? And I think that if you had to show one area, a great example, I mean, there's hundreds of examples that are in this family of examples, but that's an example of where there's a lot of agreement, I think, about that Facebook did not have the tools on the ground, the requisite cultural expertise. Obviously the genocide there has many different sources, and we can talk about causes and effects, but whatever might be the complicated causes of that crisis or others, there's at least a widespread belief that Facebook made things worse, or WhatsApp made things worse, and that there is something that could have been done differently. Now they've hired all kinds of new content moderations with moderators with Burmese language skills and things like that. But suppose we turn back the clock and we've got your multi-stakeholder initiative that is like existing at the time where you start seeing allegations of Myanmar, of genocide in Myanmar and role on Facebook. So what would you, now it's not like you're creating a red team that's going to descend into particular locations to solve particular problems, but if we think that some of the pathologies of the way these companies are operating in the global South can be addressed by this approach that you're proffering here, what would be an example of how you could sort of activate this network in a concrete crisis like that?
I'm happy to go ahead, Yasha. Okay, thank you. So one of the aims, or one of the results that we hope to be able also to test out and experiment is making sure that this network or the safe space that we're mentioning, that this lab can also serve as an early alert system. What we realize is that usually when the public eye pays attention through media, it might sometimes be too late when the problems are already very visible and very widespread on different platforms. So by including, our assumption is that a lot of the really bad things that we see on the internet, especially when it comes to content and content platforms, might happen in a more easy way in countries that do not have regulation when it comes to privacy, content, whatever, no regulation in general, that still, well, they have some connectivity, of course, but not a majority of the population that's connected. And so for certain stakeholders, this is interesting to, well, test out a lot of things and see how they are perceived by users. So one way to avoid these to become more widespread, and once they have been tested, been taken back either in Europe or in the US, one way to do that is by being in discussion, in constant discussion with organizations that observe certain things, but do not necessarily have the scientific knowledge and the scientific vocabulary to put behind this. I'll give you another very good example that dates back to 10 years ago. I was a blogger doing work for Global Voices Online, very great platforms, by the way. And, and we were reporting on a country that's called Gabon, that's located in Western Central Africa. And what we were seeing were automated profiles from Turkey, from India, from you name it, not in Gabon, but tweeting about the president and tweeting about how great it is, and using the hashtag that had been created by civil society organizations to put out in the public, in the international public, the protests that were going on in the country and that were repressed. And so those bots were flooding the hashtag with narratives in favor of the regime. At the time, I was observing that with my teams, and we didn't know that these were bots and this is not okay. We knew, well, yeah, we just knew this was happening. If we had known this was not okay, I'm sure we would have reported it to Twitter at the time, but we didn't because we didn't know it was wrong. So this is another example to show how the global focus is actually extremely interesting, even in the US and even in the EU, where I've been working a lot this last years, because it's that learning, that global learning environment that we hope to be able to foster, or at least people will feel comfortable helping us foster, will also inform the research, the scientific knowledge that's produced on social media, content and harms online. And yes, they can be studied even before they unleash their very negative effects here in the US, in Europe, but also in the countries concerned with those harms.
Nusha, did you want to jump in on that?
Thank you. No, very similar, just adding slightly to what Julia said, is that a lot of the conversation we've had with civil society organizations and activists on the ground who work at the forefront of these challenges is that these responses, Myanmar is only one example, right? But it doesn't generally happen. This kind of response by Facebook eventually does not happen in so many other countries that are not on the priority list of these major platforms. So it's only when it blows up that there's actual response. So until it gets to that level, there's not really anything that's done about it. And that's the problem. And as Julie said, this is why it's so important for us to have these knowledge hubs in different parts that are constantly working, that constantly informing us and vice versa. So it's not just a one way, we're not just sending information to them. It's just like as horizontal as a knowledge to as can be. And we've had, in different kind of dimension, we've had this kind of knowledge sharing and knowledge hubs in different contexts of war when I was working, where we were able to inform what was happening in the most remote areas on content moderation and content online when it wasn't so much fashionable, and looking at human trafficking and everything. And it was one of the most useful way of informing a centralized station what was happening in these really remote areas in the countries. So we applied this on a global stage, on a global level, where we were able to to not just find out what was happening at the time, so we don't have to wait 6 months to a year for Facebook or other platforms to respond to it, but we'll have this immediate context and knowledge of this is happening, we need to address it, otherwise it will lead to more violations of human rights.
And I think that this early alert capacity that you're talking about seems to me to be, like, in some ways the most important thing, because what you're doing is showing the relevant decision makers signs of problems before they may spin out of control. And part of the question often in the global south is like, well, Facebook doesn't have the employees that they need, or Google in a particular location, but if we could have some way to amplify, it's not as if those voices are not trying to be heard or haven't been, but they, it's hard to break through the cacophony of all the other demands that are being made on the platforms. But let me talk a little bit. So we talk about the platform. It's sort of clear that if you develop a kind of architecture of stakeholders that then gets sort of filtered through your infrastructure, that then can, the platform can listen to them. Let's talk about governments for a second, and the way you're sort of thinking about their role in the multi-stakeholder conversation, since of course in some of the areas, and as Julie was talking about with respect to different countries, you've got governments that are either view the internet as a threat or use it as a tool for manipulation. And so in contexts like that, where you're most concerned about the lack of, like, maybe civil society institutions to fight back against governments that are behaving in that way, how do you see that conversation going, and what does the multi-stakeholder approach mean for dealing with government regulation of the online space, particularly in conflict areas?
Yes, thank you so much, Nate. It's really important to talk about governments too, because we tend to focus on platforms, but a lot of what platforms are doing is on the orders of governments who are increasingly adopting very restrictive regulations. But the same way as some organizations in the civil society realm are asking for human rights impact assessments of products before they are put out for users, well, maybe government should think about kind of the same process, because what we are observing is that many of the laws that existing are not sufficiently, are not practical, to be very clear. I was talking about NetzDG. NetzDG has been criticized until very recently during the German election that just passed this weekend, was criticized for its inadequacy in responding to the threats it's supposed to respond to, but on the contrary, it's imposing too much control on freedom of expression, too much boundaries on freedom of expression. So that's one problem. The other very important aspect of making sure governments are also aware of the practicalities around the decisions that they're making is through a recent example. So the government in Nigeria has decided to ban the use of Twitter. As we're speaking now, Twitter is not directly accessible in Nigeria. You need to use a VPN. As of latest news that I have. And that decision was made in a matter of 4 days, early June, after Twitter moderated a tweet by the president of Nigeria. And in retaliation, because that's definitely what it's about, in retaliation, the government decided to shut down the platform. I think that decision, although it's not a regulation that's passed through a parliament, there is no law as of now that says that the government can do that, but nevertheless, it's a regulation, it's a decision. That decision was made, honestly, we are not aware of very valuable and very constructive conversation between the Nigerian government and Twitter prior to that takedown. On the one hand, there was very little information from the company on why particularly it deleted that said tweet. And on the other hand, there was very little information from the government on what it thought to achieve through banning Twitter. So it's within that, I would say, miscommunication space that I think it's really time to bring in more robust conversation about, is what you're doing even efficient in the first place? And unfortunately, that conversation is not sufficiently happening right now. So we hope through the lab also we hope to be able to have government representatives who can, tell us about the challenges that they're facing in moderating content, in applying their own rules, and yes, giving them the opportunity to receive feedback, not only from their constituencies, because that's not always what happens, but also from a community of people who are working on this space, who have faced probably the same challenges and can provide some advice on the way forward.
Great. Miusha, do you want to jump in on that?
Thank you. So just to add a bit to what Julia said earlier, I was mentioning that there's over 40, between 40, I mean, it keeps on increasing, and 30 more in consideration, laws that are being adopted worldwide as, concerning social media platforms. But without really involving civil society or other multi-stakeholders. And these laws can be very restrictive and a violation of the freedom of expression in the country. So for example, one of the examples beyond just looking at the common, like the usual suspect, like Turkey or India, is looking at Mauritius. So Mauritius basically used the argument that these platforms are not offered, the content moderation is not offered in the local languages, therefore the government will take over that content moderation, which has been a huge issue in the country, has raised a lot of concerns. But nothing has really been done because it's a small country and they don't really have the infrastructure to regulate or kind of enforce any kind of policies on the private sector. So it's really, this is the problem, and working in silos and not working collaborative, in a collaborative manner. So, but also taking into account how governments can abuse the lack of context of these major platforms to impose these restrictive and rules in the country.
But let's take the Nigeria example as an example, right? So we've got a situation where your network is activated, let's say, right? And we're a year down the line, and a country like Nigeria tries to shut off Twitter. What would you see the network doing in a context like that would help either address the situation or raise its visibility or something like that?
The first thing is having a channel of communication between the company and the authorities. This is another big problem that is justifying many of the very restrictive regulations that we're talking about, is because many governments do not know who to speak to when it comes to platforms. It's even worse for users. Every day we're seeing users complaining about the fact that there is no one beyond the machine. So the first usefulness, I would say, of utility, maybe it's a better word, I don't know, for this lab would be that the Nigerian government would have a way to get in touch with, I don't know, hopefully, if we do have a director of, I don't know, content, for instance, at a major social media company. We've experimented that in previous examples and in other countries, and it worked very well. One example is another country that I know very well, and which is close to Nigeria, next to Nigeria, is in Cameroon. In Cameroon in 2018, there were elections that were planned. And at the same time, the country had shut down the internet a few months before. Kind of precisely because of the fake news problem, although that problem was weaponized, but that's a broader debate. We don't have time for that today. But we thought, okay, if we want to make sure the shutdown doesn't happen because of allegedly easing the spread of fake news, of social media easing the spread of fake news, we should make sure government, civil sector organization, and social media platforms can sit together and explain what each is doing to protect, the health of the debate, the public debate prior to the election. And it was so helpful for authorities to be able to voice their concerns, because many cannot do that. And that's a problem too. And I'm speaking here to platforms. Well, they were happy to do so. And eventually there were no shutdowns, no censorship. People could talk about any debates, including about a war in the country. So I'm not saying it's all because of the conference we organized, but at least this idea that it's possible for government to reach out to an authority at the level of companies is also very important and could prevent them resorting to censorship.
You want to jump in?
Yes, thank you. Just adding to what Julie was saying, looking, for example, at other contexts and countries, the issue that is still going on in Colombia and moving away from the traditional social media platforms, looking at the private sector, the telecoms, and how internet has been either shut down or extremely slowed, and many servers and websites have been basically inaccessible to people, right? So really trying to limit the manifestations and the riots that young people have been leading over the past months, basically. So and then we've seen that in Brazil as well, has been on and off, and really no way. And civil society has always been basically really advocating for a way to contact and to have access, like Julie said, to these major platforms. They seem much more easier, for example, in Brazil to access representatives in the US, say at Facebook, at Twitter, than to access somebody within the country. Mm-hmm. It's very, very difficult. And there's a huge disconnect between Facebook offices, for example, or Twitter offices in Latin America and in the US. So there's also disconnect between the different regional offices, but having access to somebody that they can relate to, they can speak to, they can have this dialogue would really go a long way in really addressing the problem of government control and surveillance in these countries.
Great. One thing that struck me when I was starting out meeting the researchers around the world when we were working with Social Science One to try to get data out of Facebook was the different sort of economics of social media in different countries, right? So that the role that cell phone companies play, for example, in fostering monopolization of these large platforms, right? So the bundles. The idea that you could have a Facebook Lite or whatever it's called, Facebook Basic now, right? In that's sold with your plan in particular countries, right? That's the kind of thing that we don't think about that in the U.S. as if like Verizon was suddenly had a Facebook deal for you. But that's absolutely critical in the way people think about the use of WhatsApp, the use of Facebook in the developing world, in the global South. And so that I think is something that I'd say the Western analysts of this, and I think Julie, you were suggesting this before, right? The research on this, a lot of people are not focusing on this, like on how the sort of the connections to the different parts of the internet stack or the mobile companies, and how that has an impact on what people see, as well as the way sort of life is conducted with governments, right? So that a lot of constituent service, in certain African countries is done over WhatsApp, right? A lot of financial transactions, right, in ways that we don't see if you focus on the West. Obviously, as our colleague Daphne Keller, she has a set of bingo cards for when we have a content moderation conference. And the content moderation, one of the bingos is it's really all about WhatsApp, right? If you don't understand WhatsApp, and it's like in the U.S. because we have low WhatsApp usage, it's not as big a deal. But you look around the world, and it's a much more prominent platform. I want to turn to apropos of that, I want to turn to some of the questions that we're getting from the audience, and let me start with a few that deal with AI. And thinking about automated filtration versus individual content moderation, because that does seem to me that one of the reasons your project is really well positioned, I think, to make a splash here is that we're having a debate, I think, around the world about the relative strength and role of AI systems versus individual content moderation, with all the downsides of the downsides to the moderators themselves, as well as the difficulties that the companies face. What would you so as you think about the role of, say, your effort in and multi-stakeholderism in general in trying to guide development of these algorithms that are doing so much of what is really the content moderation, with notoriously over-inclusive and bad effects in the global South, right? Because so much of it is based off of models that are developed in the West and then tried to rolled out in cookie cutter fashion in the global South. How would you talk about that and the priority of that issue for your group, and how you could see having an impact on the way the companies are doing automated content moderation?
I'm happy to jump in on this because it's related to a lot of work that I do with my organization. One of the big problems right now when we talk about content policy in general, but specifically the moderation, is language. The automation doesn't understand Fulani, for instance, a language widely spoken in West Africa, doesn't barely understand Lingala, for instance, which is another major language in in the Great Lakes region. So the reason for that is that, well, they will say they're not enough users. I tend to disagree with that, but since not all the data are available because we have to protect privacy, I can't speak to that. But more seriously, we hope that this setting can lead to concrete collaborations between, maybe there is a project out there that is looking at this language deficiency within the AI. There are plenty, actually. I can name at least 3, including one developed by a great Stanford graduate student, Liza Einstein. She's working in collaboration with another researcher from Guinea, and they're working on a data set in Fulani, I think, if I'm not mistaken. There are many other examples out there. I know that Mozilla also has a huge project providing more languages to machine learning systems. So these are initiatives that could be extremely helpful to organizations, to companies and to governments too, helping them understand how the automation works, because that's another aspect. They do not understand technicalities most of the time. So it's important to explain to them as well. But in addition to coming up with making a sort of, I was about to say rencontre, but that's not the word in English. I apologize. Meeting, kind of. Instead of connecting, that's the word I was looking for, instead of connecting just a project with a company, what we actually hope to be able is to foster a conversation even about this project, even about the company's solution that they might want to work on, about a language problem that they're facing. What does it mean to have a data set of hateful language words in XYZ language? Does that list actually make sense all the time, or does it even more make sense in when you're having an election, or when there is a debate about, I don't know, female sexual right? Is it that there are different ways in which a word can become dangerous? So why not having a thinking through about, instead of having just, words put out there, let's think about the context behind those words, and who can bring that context? Well, it's precisely those organizations, those individuals working on either this projects, data sets, but also beyond that, female rights activists, human rights activists in those countries, any other groups that are really concerned about how their context can impact the understanding of how content is deploying its effect in their countries and realities. And we also hope that this exchanges can inform the content policy process and even the content policy making process within the companies. If you want to enforce more AI, what are the consequences? What are the trade-offs? Maybe you won't be able to understand all the languages, but if you do, maybe you should insist on making sure the right context is added to that database. Otherwise, we might fall into the same problems that are existing right now.
Yes, and just adding a couple of things, even when we look at language, say, for example, something that's in Arabic that's applicable and contextualized within Lebanon or Saudi Arabia would be completely different than looking at something in another country, right? So we have to look at beyond just the language and what it means in each context. We also have to look at the cultural values, the religious values, how that content can be harmful to one population but not to another. So it's in the same debates that we have, the same discourse that we have about how do we address bias in AI, and by including different stakeholders in the design of AI and the data beyond just diversifying the data, we have to do the same thing when we look at automated content moderation. We have to be able to include these different stakeholders in thinking about it and feeding that kind of contextualized data, like Julie was saying, to the creation of those algorithms. So it's really, and not just talking about it, but actually doing it. So we're hoping to really go beyond. When people ask us, are you going to be able to impact research or is it policy? We want to impact it at all levels. Really thinking about not just physical content, in-person content moderation, but also automated content moderation. You're on mute.
Yep, I accidentally did that because I saw that Julie wanted to answer one of the questions that was submitted by the audience live. And so this one question is from our anonymous attendee, is about how to which labs would you want to collaborate with? If there are labs that are listening, what would you tell them to do?
Yes, obviously the content policy there are too many challenges, and although we have a lot of ambition, that's for sure, we are only humans. So of course we can't solve everything. And there are certainly aspects that other organizations, labs, centers, you name it, have been gathering significant knowledge about. So yes, we are open to working with those other initiatives, other universities, other, Nyusha mentioned the pop-up initiatives or outside of the US even. So that's one way that we are interested in collaborating. But yes, we can partner on workshops. If there are certain discussions that you'd like to have, we have one on dangerous organizations coming up. We'll have another one on other platforms, content platforms. We're also thinking about one on elections, and with many elections coming up in 2022, in particularly one that's very interesting to me, which is in France, the French presidential election. So there are certain thematics that definitely call for collaboration with other labs and centers working on these issues.
Similar to that, there was a question about getting youth involved. How do you, Anna Carolina asks, could you elaborate more on how you plan to involve youth in the lab's work?
I'm just going to take that because this is my area of expertise. I'm very passionate about working with young people. I think it's really impossible to think about anything digital without including youth, right? And then we see that as we think that youth are being more and more apolitical, I would say that it's quite the contrary. They're not being consulted, and they're being quite political, and they're being really loud and clear about what they're expecting to see, reflected in the societies. And they're really using different digital means and tools and platforms to really leapfrog into spaces that have been traditionally and historically exclusive to them. So we plan to have, actually we have we're not just looking at multi-stakeholderism in just different sectors and different regions around the world, but also different age groups. So we have very young people informing who will help us to inform and craft kind of solution and thinking forward. So we're very much excited to learn from them. So that's definitely a yes.
Julie, you mentioned your work on the oversight board and how this has kind of informed your view that there's a real need for this kind of approach. Could you maybe put up maybe give us a concrete example or more sort of just elaborate on what it is in your experience in dealing with these cases from around the world that has made you feel that there's this kind of vacuum there that needs to be filled?
Oh, yes. The experience at the board has been so fascinating in the past year. It's been almost a year that we're accepting cases from all around the world. And through that work, I've been privileged to see some of the major issues that are, making hard to moderate content. One of these issues is, of course, the issue of transparency. What you can tell and be helpful to the public, and what you have to withhold and how to withhold it. Yes, that's one of the aspects. The other aspect is, well, dangerous organizations is a big issue, especially now with what's happened recently in Afghanistan, but also even related to white supremacism and how it deploys, how groups are tied on different social media platforms, content platforms in general. But most importantly, I think one of the best learnings I've had is how much outside perspective has informed the work that we do at the Oversight Board. We have different ways of engaging with organizations and users as well. And honestly, I've learned so much from these interactions. So yes, hopefully we'll get even more interactions, interesting interactions with the lab.
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you both for both starting up this lab and introducing the world to it today. We're lucky to have you here at Stanford. Those who want to be involved with this new lab, there were a lot of questions that were in chat about sort of the stakeholders in the multi-stakeholder approach. Please email us at cyber-center@stanford.edu, and we'll forward it to those who are involved in the lab. We're also, this is the first of weekly seminars that we're going to be having, most of which will be falling in the kind of traditional academic category, but I wanted to start off with this revolutionary new lab so that people can see the practical work that we're trying to do here at the Cyber Center. You can see the on your screen right now the list of people who will be presenting over the course of the next 2 months, and then we will have some new presentations, a new group that starts in January. But next week, our own Becca Lewis here at Stanford, who's done an enormous amount of work on almost the sociology of platforms like YouTube and the content creators and the sort of ecosystem on these platforms, will be talking, and then followed by our own Sujong Kim, who's a PBI postdoc scholar. And then we have several law professors. I couldn't help but have some of those law professors come in so I could maintain cred with that community. But please come back next week when we continue this, and please contact us about the new Center for Social Media, or the new Social Content Policy and Society Lab here at the Cyber Policy Center. Thank you again for everyone for joining, and thank you, Niyusha and Julie, for kicking us off. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.